Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's APM webinar, How to Delegate Effectively so the job gets done on time and to the standard you want. I'm delighted that Andrew Payne has joined us again. My name's Robert Allen, and I'm the APM Branches Manager, and I'll be your host today. You'll find yourselves in a mute mode, but we're keen for your interaction. Andrew is happy to receive your questions, and I will put these to Andrew at the end of the session. To submit your question, just go on your control panel into the questions section and type in your question. This webinar will count towards your CPD and should last no more than 1 hour. I would like to personally say thank you to Andrew, but also to the volunteers of the APM branches and the APM SIGs for all their hard work with making these webinars happen. So, Andrew is a TEDx speaker, works with business leaders, helping them to avoid burnout while thriving in their roles and delivering their potential. Andrew has served a broad range of organisations, schools, colleges, institutions, charities and the NHS. I'm delighted that Andrew's come back to join us. I'm really looking forward to today's webinar. So Andrew, over to you.
Thank you. So, I wonder if there's anyone on this webinar who you gave someone a job to do. You wanted them to do the job and you thought you were pretty clear about what needed to be done and that you spent some time going over that with the person you're giving the job to, but they made a mess of the job. They absolutely messed it up. And you couldn't help but think, well, why? How did this happen that they messed the job up? And I wonder if there's anyone here who has ever had a job where, having been burnt before in the noble art of delegation, this time was super clear. Not only were you super clear, you wrote down a list of instructions for the person that you were delegating to. Surely this time you couldn't possibly go wrong. But they still made a mess of the delegation. And you're like, what is wrong with people? It is tough being a professional when you're surrounded by amateurs. And I wonder if there's anyone here who has ever given a job to someone to do when you were in a rush and you were racing out the office and you sort of say, listen, John, and apologies to anyone on this webinar called John, I need you to finish this and do a good job. It's got to be in by the close of play. And then you race out the office. And the next morning, John's done it, but he hasn't submitted the job as he should have done. And the job is still there on his desktop. He hasn't sent it off. And you're like, John, what did you not understand about the close of play? What did he not get about that? When you think about it, delegation, the art of giving someone else a job to do, should be quite straightforward. I want us to think about that. I want you to just think for a moment about the times when you've delegated and it hasn't gone according to plan. Now, before I move on, I'm going to try and sort these slides out because they don't seem to be playing. So just bear with me a moment. Let's go through again and see if they can work. Okay, I seem to be getting some slides working, which is good. So delegation, when you think about it, there's 3 types of delegation that we generally experience in our day-to-day lives. The first is when we give a task to someone to do because even though they're perhaps busier than we are, they're just infinitely better qualified to do the job. So it just makes sense. Sometimes we give someone a job to do because we're paying them. It could be a plumber. It could be a consultant. They have an expertise. We are buying their expertise. And sometimes we give someone a job to do because although we ourselves could do the job, we want to free up time for ourselves and we also want to develop the other person. Now, I'm guessing that most of you didn't log on to this webinar to learn how to do number 2. You probably weren't thinking you need advice on how to delegate a job to your plumber or some consultant that you're paying. And I'm guessing that probably most of you logged onto this webinar because you want insight and strategies that you can use with number 3. Because although it feels like it should be easy, you just give someone a job to do, a lot of companies get it wrong. In fact, in a recent Harvard Business Review survey, they surveyed 332 companies in America. And half of those companies admitted that they were worried about their employees' poor delegation skills. But of those 160 companies that expressed that concern, only a third of them were going to do anything about it, less than a third. So what about 100 companies that are worried about their employees' poor delegation skills, but they're not going to do anything about it? I wonder what the cost is. I wonder on their bottom line, I wonder what the cost is for their business leaders who, because they don't know how to delegate, so if they delegate, they get bad results. So having got bad results, they hang on to the jobs and they become more and more overburdened. They're the ones that everybody looks to step up to the plate. They're the ones that hold on to all the jobs and they get burnt out. What is the cost? And what's the cost to the team where they feel like they can't do the job, or they feel frustrated because they think they can do the job, but they're not getting the opportunity to do it? We all know that a common reason for why people leave their company is because they don't like their boss or their manager, or something has broken down in that relationship. What's the cost of the recruitment fees, of the retraining, of the inducting? What's the cost of teams who have not developed their full skill set, so they become disengaged? And we all know that where you get disengagement, so follows absenteeism, so follows presenteeism and sick leave and all the rest of it. There is a cost to not delegating and not knowing how to delegate well. Because if you do delegate, but you don't do it well, you'll get this. You'll get dumped on people who feel like they're burdened down and they're just being used. They're not being developed and appreciated. So my name's Andrew Payne, and as you can probably see from my webcam, I don't look a thing like my headshot anymore. In fact, although this headshot was taken a couple of years ago, because it's black and white, it can hold a multitude of sins. It does wonders for my self-confidence. But these are the kind of areas that I cover when I'm working with business leaders. And I support business leaders in the third sector and the corporate sector. Often I'm looking at boundaries. How do you put in boundaries that ensure that you're not pulled into things you don't want to get pulled into, to ensure that you don't end up tolerating stuff you know to be wrong, but you just don't have the fight to come up against it and do something about it. And boundaries, it sounds abstract. So how do you actually create boundaries so that you are stronger tomorrow than you are today? I look at priorities, and you'd have thought prioritizing, that's fairly easy. You just order your stuff in a queue. And it is, as long as the queue behaves itself. But when the queue misbehaves and you've got people at the back wanting to be at the front and people in the middle wanting to be at the front, and you're under pressure and it's kicking off, then prioritizing wisely becomes more of a challenge. As some of you have already been on my procrastination webinar that I delivered some time ago, I do a lot around picking apart procrastination, understanding procrastination and the link with burnout. I do stuff with delegation, which you'll be pleased to know, because this is what this webinar is about. And you're probably thinking, well, he must be a bit of an expert on delegation because that's what he's covering at work and he's doing his webinar. I would say I'm a work in progress. We can always get better, but I'm a lot better at delegation today than I used to be. And I will share with you some of my old bad habits in a moment. I also work with people around scheduling and planning. How do you turn a humble diary into a banging time management system? I look around critical decision making, helping people work through the dilemmas that they typically get stuck in. And we look at resilience, developing that inner grit. That's typically my work when I'm working with business leaders. But as I say, delegation is what we're going to focus on. Now, I used to be terrible at delegating. And it all started for me really when I got my first job in recruitment. And like anyone in the 90s, I graduated in 97. I didn't know what I wanted to do for a job. So I became a recruitment consultant. I didn't even know what a recruitment consultant was. On my first day of work, I still didn't know what I was really going into, but I liked the fact that I was going to be called a consultant. It kind of felt quite fitting. And there was so much management spiel in those days, back in the 90s. Aim high, fly higher. Aim for the stars and you'll get to Mars. My boss's favorite was, don't come to me with your problems. Come to me with your solutions, which I always found particularly unhelpful when I had a problem because I didn't know what the solution was. After a couple of years at that first firm, it was pretty cutthroat. It was a lot of I wasn't well suited to it, but I was deemed now fit enough to be a team leader. Most people got there more quickly in 2 years than I did, but hey ho, team leader. And I thought it was long overdue that my skills were recognized. And I thought I'd be a fantastic leader because I'm a likable kind of a chap, not like some of the other aggressive team leaders that I used to work with. I was a nice guy. I wanted to help my team. And so I would tell them again and again and again what needed to be done. You know, if I had to delegate the job of making a cup of tea to them, my delegation process would look like this. I'd write them a long list of step-by-step instructions, so there is no possible way they can make a mistake. And I would ensure that they stuck to every single point by point. Don't do anything out of order. This is how I delegated. But the more that was my leadership approach, the more they would just come to me and nag me the whole time. And the more I started to resent my team. There was a team of 4 guys that I led. 2 of them I thought were all right. And 2 of them I started to think, yeah, they're just absolute clowns. There's no way I would have hired them, but I've had the misfortune of taking this team on. It wasn't long till I left that employer looking to work with better people, because of course it wasn't my fault at all. But years later, as I've gone through that coaching journey for myself and really seen the difference that coaching can make to relationships, to activity, to motivation, it's made a big difference to how I delegate. And so today, we're going to look at this. This is our schedule for today. We're going to look at the 6 danger points, the 6 common mistakes that I see. So when I'm working with business leaders, they're often burnt out, but when you really unpick things, they're not delegating properly. I want to work through 6 of the most common mistakes that I see. But I want to be clear here. I'm not saying you must never do any of these 6. You must never commit any of these 6 cardinal sins. I'm not saying that. I'm saying that these are danger areas that if you make these cardinal sins your norm for how you delegate, then that handover process is likely to be compromised or flawed. So I'm flagging them up. But as we work through them, you'll see what I'm saying. I'm not saying never do them because it would be ridiculous for some of them, but be aware that they are danger points. The second part of today's webinar is looking at the 3 pillars of effective delegation, the things that you must have in place first if you are going to delegate effectively, and then we'll work through a checklist. But I want to be very clear, it's a 6-part checklist. Each part begins with the letter R, fancy that, but that checklist is effective so long as you have those 3 pillars in place. If you don't have those 3 pillars in place, it doesn't matter what kind of checklist you'll have, your handover will be flawed. So let's start with the 6 danger points. So as I call them, the 6 cardinal sins of delegation, which helpfully make this acronym of crimes. And the first is C for control. So you want to control the task, as I used to. You want to control it step by step because you're nervous if you give over control, the other person will mess it up. But when we want to control the task from start to finish, it can often turn us into a bossy person, giving out instruction after instruction after instruction. And you have to realize that the more that people hear, or the more instructions there are, the less that people will remember them, because there's only so much that people can take in, whether that's written down or whether that's verbally. The less instructions you give, the more likely it is that people will remember. So there has to be a balance. I'm not saying you can't give instructions, but the more you control and the longer that list of instructions becomes, the greater it could be that the person listening to you is going to get bored, and they're looking at you, but they're not really listening to you. But they won't say to you that they're not listening to you. When we want to control the whole task, it can become a problem. We have to let go of some of the autonomy for how that task gets done. Often people delegate in a rush. And of course, that is why we delegate sometimes. So I'm not saying you mustn't ever delegate in a rush. What I am saying is when you delegate, if it is your habit that it's a bit of an afterthought, a handover process, or you're racing to get through it, then you're less likely to be thinking about long-term development of that person. You're just dumping the task. And in that rush, that connection, that dynamic with that other person you're delegating to could be compromised. So beware if that is your habit. This is a common mistake that I see. So you could say to someone, do a good job. I need you to do it really thoroughly this time. You could say to your teenager, I need you to sort your room out. I want it really clean and tidy. What do those words actually mean? They're all ambiguous words. Your clean and tidy is no doubt different to your teenager's version of clean and tidy. Your version of a job done thoroughly is no doubt different to your team member's version of a job done thoroughly. So when you're beginning to work through the handover process, every word that you use, you've got to stay clear of ambiguity. It's got to be clear, specific outcomes that you and the person you're delegating to, you see the same thing that needs to be done and the same thing that needs to be achieved. Don't imply, clarify, make it clear. Myopic is where people delegate just for a short-term fix. They just want to get some stuff off their shoulders. And of course, that's understandable. We all want to do that to a point. But if you're just thinking short-term and just getting rid of the task, you're not thinking about the long-term development of the person you're delegating to. And we all win as leaders and as managers if the people that we're working with are resourceful and intelligent. And that comes partly from us developing longer-term development strategies. And delegation is the opportunity to develop someone. So beware if your motivation for delegating is always just a short-term dumping of the task. And ease, which is linked to the short-termism. We just want an easier life, but that shouldn't be the only reason we delegate. It doesn't matter if it's some of the reason, but we should be wanting to delegate so that we can create better team players who are more equipped tomorrow than they are today. And the last mistake is selection. And where I often see people go wrong with this is, if they're being really honest, they give the tasks to the people that are most likely to say yes most easily with the least fuss. Often I see this where you've got someone at work and they're a difficult personality. They're a bit of a grunt, never quite know how they're going to be. And so the thought of delegating tasks to them, and they might pull faces and huff and puff. I've worked with some huffers and puffers, and it's just annoying when you're delegating a task. It's much easier to delegate a task to someone with a beaming smile. Yes, I'll do it. But that person could already be overworked. That person may not be the right person for the task. Don't just give the job to Thingamajig because Thingamajig will say yes. Ensure that your selection is appropriate to the right skill set, and don't let people off the hook just because they're difficult to deal with. Those are my 6 crimes to be aware of. That's what I'm saying. Be aware of these crimes. So what about the 3 pillars? Well, what do they look like? First of all, when I work with business leaders and the delegation process is flawed, they're not delegating, or they have been delegating, but they're tearing their hair out. Often I see that their delegation process is email, it's done by email, or it could be literally paper and pen, but it's generally email. And I would say when you delegate a task, of course, if it's like a quick, I need you to post a letter, it's not a complicated task that you're delegating. Of course, you might want to email that. You don't need to ring the person to ask them to post a letter. But for more complicated jobs that you're going to delegate, have a 2-way conversation. And a conversation means not just you going on and on and on about what needs to be done and why and how. And we all want to feel like we're intelligent and we're knowledgeable. We love talking and imparting our knowledge. It's a good feeling. But when we're delegating, we have to be very careful that that inner neediness doesn't cause us to talk too much, because the more you talk, the more likely it is that the other person will start to zone out a little. They'll look at you with those kind of half-glazed eyes, or they might look quite attentive, but in their mind, they're already thinking about their shopping. Have a 2-way conversation. Pick up the phone. Do it on WhatsApp. Do it on Zoom if you have to. I know some of us are zoomed out, so maybe use the phone, but have a conversation. And a 2-way conversation, therefore, and this is the second pillar, would be the balance between questions and instructions. And one of the things I learned most as I came through the coaching stuff I was doing was ask insightful questions. Start getting people thinking about what you're talking about and interacting with you. Don't ask questions as the Spanish Inquisition would have asked them. And I've worked with people before where the way they ask questions, you suddenly feel very defensive. But ask gentle, open, insightful questions about the task that get people thinking about the task and talking to you. And that creates that 2-way conversation. Too many instructions and people will not remember. People will zone out. And the other thing I would say with instructions is the more you can give positive instructions rather than negative instructions, the more memorable they are. So for example, don't send it out like that. Replace with, actually, we need to do some more work on this and this and this because, or if you're working with if you're with your kids, don't step in the road, stay on the pavement. The positive direct command is more effective than negative commands. Try and eradicate don'ts from your language. Try and have a day where you don't say the word don't. It's actually quite a challenge. The third pillar is respect and rapport. And of course, you don't need a lesson from me on respect and rapport. So I'll skate through this very quickly, but they're very different things, actually. You can respect someone because you know they're honest, but not actually like them because they're just difficult and they're in your face and they don't ever tone down what needs to be said and they're almost too honest and it's hard to be with them. Or you can have good rapport with someone and think they're a laugh and they're someone you want to be in the pub with you, but you know that they exaggerate. You know that they're not completely honest in what they say. They're a bit two-faced. So you probably wouldn't have them as a trusted member of your inner circle, but they're great to spend time with. Ideally, we want to be doing things practically that build respect and rapport with our team, or if this is about home stuff, then with our kids. And everything that we're covering today doesn't just apply at work. It does apply with how you raise your kids and how you develop them. And so, given that respect and rapport are so important, let's just put this into context. Imagine I had a terrible weekend with my teenage daughter. I've got 3 boys under 8, and I've got a teenage daughter who's 16. Imagine we got on so badly. I don't know, we've fallen out over her phone and social media. She's been a grump. She's not helping. And it's been a bad weekend. Anyone with teenagers knows sometimes you just have a bad weekend with them. Imagine at the end of that weekend, I want her to do a job for me and I start telling her, or even if I'm asking her questions, do you really think she'll be invested in doing that job? Do you really think she's going to listen to the best of her ability? Or do you think if I asked her the same stuff after we've had a brilliant weekend together, where we've got on well and we're in great rapport and we're bouncing off each other, and again, anyone with teenagers will know sometimes you have a great weekend. Of course, she's going to listen and invest more in the task when she's in better rapport with me, when that feeling is of just liking each other and respecting each other is strong. But the same applies at work. So you've got to ask yourself as leaders, practically, is there anything that you do which might weaken the respect or the rapport that your team has for you? Is there anything in your habits? Is there anything in your behavior? Is there anything in the way that you relate to your team? Is there anything about the distance between you and your team at the moment where you realize there is a gulf? And I'm not talking like a physical gulf, but you're just not connecting with them in the way that you could be. Think about it. What practically can you do? Please stop anything that you're doing that will really weaken the respect of the rapport that the team has for you. And then the opposite. What are the practical things you could do right now that will build on that respect and rapport with your team? Because if you get respect and rapport right, you are putting the foundations in place so that when you go through your checklist, when you do that delegating, they are going to be more up for the task. They're going to be more, they can be keener to do a good job and to listen and talk with you and really make sure they know what needs to be done. And of course, if you know that you already do great stuff, then what could you do to do more of it and build on it? Think about it practically. Think about your diary day by day. What are the little things you could add in that would make a huge difference? Would it be the extra phone call to not to check up, but to check in with your team and how are they? I mean, this isn't even a work call. I'm thinking about you. I know you're juggling the kids at home. How's it been going for you? And this is the stuff I'm struggling with. What are you struggling with? Do you have those kind of conversations? So think about how do you develop the respect and rapport? Because once you have these 3 critical pillars in place, then it's time to start thinking about a checklist. So let me go through the 6 BIR, the 6 things that I will always look at when I'm delegating, particularly a complicated task. The first is around selection and reality check. Is the person that I have in mind to do this job, are they absolutely the right person to do this job in terms of skill set and in terms of where I want them to be and in terms of where they want to be as well? Are they ready today? Or is there a time of preparation that is required? Are there extra skills that they need? Should I delegate half of the job to them? Because delegating the full job to them, they're not ready for it. And in which case, how do I break it down so they can just do some of it? How do I prepare them? But that reality check is so important. And if you put the wrong person in to do the job, often because you're just going for someone that's going to say yes, then be prepared for disappointing results. The second step that I'd be very clear about is what is the outcome? We want to give the delegate some sense of autonomy in how they make that outcome happen so that they can make some mistakes and learn from them. But what is the absolute result that needs to be achieved? And that has to be very clear. Does the person I'm delegating to, how do I know that they see the same result that I do? And also, and again, I see this as a problem, what authority does my delegate have to deliver this job? How much authority am I going to give them? What parameters have they got to work with? The third key area that I look at is around risk. And this is a great way of opening up conversation in order so that it's not just a list of instructions. Well, what are the things that could go wrong with this? Let's think about this. Where are the danger points, or whatever language is appropriate to you and feels right for you? But start getting your delegate to think about the risks. Get them to identify the risks, not you. You only need to come up with the risk if they can't think of it. Now, I worked with a charity where they were really worried about GDPR, and they were worried because they had a number of paid van drivers who did a lot of delivery stuff for them, who would often have addresses and sensitive information of the beneficiaries that the charity was serving. And they were worried. They wanted me to do a training session around GDPR with these van drivers. There's about 4 of them. I was like, okay, well, I'll go in and I want to talk to them first so I can understand whether we need to do a full training session. Do I need to really do it? So I went in, I made a cup of tea, we sat around a table, we had a chat. And my question was, listen, have you heard about this GDPR stuff? They all nodded their heads. Well, what do you understand has just happened? And they all knew what had happened with data and answer. But then the question is, well, how does this affect you in your roles? Are there any gaps, do you think, that we need to plug in the way that you do your job? They came up with all the risks themselves. They didn't need me to train them. They were saying, well, sometimes we leave the doors unlocked when we leave the van for a moment. Sometimes we leave the windows down on a hot day. Sometimes the sheets are facing up, so I guess someone could. They didn't need me. They needed me to perhaps just ask them so that they could remind themselves and identify the hazards for themselves. Resources. Be very clear what resources your delegate can draw on, which includes, if you feel that your delegate needs a lot of support and they are indicating that they need a lot of support, well, what does that look like? Can they call you whenever they want? Because if you say that, you need to be prepared to deliver that. Or actually, well, listen, I think you can do this, but do you know what? On Thursday, how do you feel about us having a 10-minute conversation? Let's book that in. And anything that I want you to try and figure it out for yourself till then, if you're missing anything, but we'll talk. It's up to you to sort that out with the delegate, but understand what resources does the delegate need? What can they draw on? What can they ask for and how? And what does that checking in process look like? And I don't like the word checking up on someone. For me, it has the wrong connotation. You're checking in with your delegate to see how they're doing, see whether they need more support, see what progress they're making. But be very clear about the resources so that you're not nagged to death when you weren't expecting to be. Ramifications. I mean, I guess I could have said consequences, but ramifications fits in with 6x-R, which to me just feels a bit neat. And ramifications, consequences, it's the same thing. So is your delegate absolutely clear of what might happen if this job is done well or if it's done badly? Do they understand the value of the job? Because if they don't see the value of the job, then they're less likely to give it the attention that they should do. So again, another example, this was a different charity where I was doing some recruiting for them, and we had a number of cleaners because they had a number of retail premises. And whenever we were hiring cleaners, I was always very clear, listen, this is not just a cleaning role. Okay, let's be clear about this. This is a business development role, because the cleaner each retail premises is and the nicer it looks, the more time that people will spend in it, the more money they will spend. So actually the cleaning, there's a very direct link between cleaning and business sales, which pays everybody's salary, which ensures the charity can do its charitable objects. This cleaning role is critical. It is not just a cleaning role. But the same applies in any other setting. Can your delegate truly see the value of the job that they're doing? And how are you going to ensure that they do? If they do see the value, they will put more into the task. And this is so important today with coronavirus, and we're at home more, working from home, and there's so much worry out there. You know, some people are worried about the fact that they're not so visible anymore. So, you know, the impact of that on their career development. Some of us are worried, or have been really worried, about our loved ones who might be shielding, and we don't want, you know, we're worried about whether they'll get coronavirus. Some of us are just worried because we can't do any work. And I fit into this because of my kids at home. Even when they went back to school in September, for the whole time from September to December, there was just 1 week where we didn't have one of our kids at home due to a COVID bubble bursting, getting stuff done. And so there's been so much worry and fear. And of course, coronavirus feels like it's come from nowhere with no warning. And so the relational side of leadership is so important at the moment. Bear in mind that you don't have to be super busy to burn out. You can burn out just through worry and being stuck at home. So when you're delegating, how do you build those relationships? What are you going to do practically to make sure that you create this kind of dynamic, this healthy dynamic where there's an honest exchange of information, an honest exchange of where people's fears are at, where people feel that they're really struggling? How do you do that? What are you going to do if the person's falling behind? What are you going to do if it's clear that the early stages of the job, they've messed it up? How are you going to handle that as a leader? What is your language going to look like? How are you going to come alongside the person you're delegating to so they really feel that you're with them? And bear in mind, some people need a different level of support to others. It doesn't mean that those that need more support are more troublesome team members. It doesn't mean that they're any lesser than those that don't need much support. There have been times in my life where I've needed more support in my work because I'm so sleep deprived from my children. I can barely stay awake at work. There are other times in my life where I'm in a great place. I'm in a much better place today, thankfully. My boys do at least sleep. So if you gave me a task to do, many tasks that I'm given, I wouldn't need a lot of support. But there are times of my life where I do. So you have to understand very clearly what support does your delegate need. And this relationship part is so important. If it goes wrong, how are you going to create this kind of culture of reflection? And also, if it goes well, how are you going to create this culture of reflection so that you're not only celebrating what's gone well, you're really drawing it out and saying, okay, well, what can we learn? We don't just learn from our mistakes. We obviously learn from our successes. So a number of things to remember, whether you are delegating at home to your kids, whether you're delegating at work to a team. Danger points. Just be aware that if you are guilty of these crimes on a regular basis, your delegation process could be flawed. If you are guilty of these crimes, try and make it the exception rather than the norm. That's what we've got to try to work towards. Get those pillars of delegation in place, which may mean some practical things that you need to do to invest in your relationships with the people around you and the people that you work with. And then have a checklist. And for some of you, you might be thinking, blimey, if I'm going to delegate a task, I'm never going to remember all 6 of those things. Well, you probably already do 1 or 2 of them. So maybe just add in another one and make sure that as you work through your checklist, once you've selected the person and you're now thinking about results, risks, resources, make sure that you're asking more questions so you're not just giving instructions, because it's so boring to be on the receiving end of tons of instructions. So in a minute, we're going to open this back up for some questions and answers. For anyone who's found value in what we've gone through today, I hugely appreciate any kind of connection with your internal L&D people or MDs or CEOs. I do a variety of learning and development strategies as workshops, as keynotes, and you've seen in my earlier slide different areas I get involved with. So I'd love a connection or a recommendation. For anyone who thinks, well, actually, I need to up my leadership game, is coaching really expensive? Is he the kind of coach that's going to try and lure me into a multi-thousand-pound coaching? No, I'm not. If you're interested in finding out about some kind of coaching program that doesn't have to cost the earth, but that can create the result that you want, then if you go onto my website, halfway down the homepage, you can book a free strategy call, and we can just explore where you're at, whether I'm the right coach for you, and what kind of a coaching program, what that would look like. So do book a call if you found value in today and you want to take it further. And the last thing I would say, anybody that's been on this webinar today and you've really enjoyed it, I'd love it if you could say so on social media and tag me into it, because I get a lot of business from social media. That means a lot to me. But that's as much as I'm going to talk about in terms of a sale. I'm not into a hard selling proposition. And so what I want to do now, in the time that we've got left, we've got a bit of time left, I want to open it up to questions and answers. So I'm going to hand back and just stop my screen share now.
Perfect. Thank you, Andrew. We've had a lot of great comments coming through from everyone saying thank you for sharing your knowledge once again. So I'll dive straight into the questions, and I can see Chelsea's asked a question that's linked to pillar number 3, the respect and rapport. And she said, can you suggest any methods of strengthening respect/rapport with your team?
I once heard it said from a fundraising guru that you get the best out of people when they truly believe that you would throw rocks at their enemies. And I guess what he means by that is that when people truly believe that you're on their side, that you feel their pain, you see their pain, that you're interested in their pain, but that also that you see what they're hoping for, you've got time to listen to that, then that's where the magic happens in terms of that kind of dynamic relationship. So there are some things that can break respect and rapport. You could say, listen, let's have this conversation, you book a meeting, and then you're forever putting it back because urgent calls come in from your clients. So you're forever putting off what you promised to deliver for someone in your team. That breaks rapport, for example. Whereas if you are someone who is careful about your promises, but you make sure that your promises are absolutely delivered on, that builds rapport. So, I mean, there is a long list. When you really think about it, what does it take to create a strong relationship? How do you create that healthy bank account that's in credit? And how do you take away the credit? Well, it's the same as in any relationship. Respect and rapport is about truly taking time to understand the other person and where they're at. It's about sharing your own struggles so they feel safe to share their struggles and they can see that you're someone that's prepared to be honest and vulnerable at times. It's about having principles that you don't budge on, but also having stuff that people can actively see you compromising on certain things. So people get that sense of, okay, John or Katie or whoever the leader is, there's things that they absolutely wouldn't budge on, and I know where we stand with that. There's things that they'd be flexible on and compromise on. They're very clear and intentional about that. And there's things that they'd absolutely roll over on, and they're intentional about those. And so some of it as well, in terms of respect and rapport, is knowing your boundaries. And I do a lot of work with leaders around boundaries, understanding those boundaries, understanding how to communicate them and adhere to them, and encouraging other people to talk through their boundaries, and so that you are in line, you can understand what their boundaries are. And we're all different. We all have different boundaries. So, for example, when I look at boundaries, you can have your castle walls you won't budge on. You can have your flexible fencing where there's some give, but not lots of give. You're compromised to a point. And you can have your line in the sand boundaries, and a line in the sand, if you think about what it is, you just step over it. These are your preferences that you state how you feel and what you want, but you wouldn't care that much if someone breached that boundary line. And it's healthy to have that suite of boundaries and to really understand that and communicate that. So, I mean, it's a long list. We could do a full day workshop on how to create respect and rapport, but I hope that gives you something to go with.
Excellent. Thank you, Andrew and Chelsea. I hope that helps. I think, Andrew, what you were mentioning there were people and boundaries, and I can see a couple of the questions coming in linked to culture. So I'll try and summarize it into one, but how do you create a culture of reflection and self-improvement? Are there any tips for doing this?
Yeah, I mean, some of it is creating the time to do so. I work with a board of trustees in one area where, like, they've had an amazing year in spite of COVID. Their bank account is, and they've always said, oh, well, when we've got the money to do this, we'll do that. When we've got the money, we'll be happier, we'll be more celebratory. They're not more celebratory at all. They're just as they were. There's not, they should be throwing a party. They should be saying, actually, looking at that senior management team, we've done an amazing job through COVID. We need to actually buy them like a gift that they'd appreciate, that they'd really like. We need to show them that we really value that. So some of it is the small touches that show that people really notice the success. When things go wrong, I often look at Premier League football managers, because I'm a bit of a football nut, their language after a defeat. And I try and look at someone like Klopp, for example, at Liverpool. I know he's having a tougher time this season, but I'm not a Liverpool fan. He's got a long injury list. But last year, I mean, his leadership was just phenomenal. It really was. And when you look at the language of first-class leaders, when things go wrong, how do they encourage reflection? Well, the first is that they talk about the thing that's gone wrong in very temporary terms. It went wrong today. We're not playing at our best at the moment. So all negative statements are expressed in very deliberately temporary terms. Klopp will then draw in some of the external things that affected the problem that no one had any control over, but they did affect the problem. It might be an injury list, it might be the ref's decision, it might be VAR, and he'll draw those in to take the heat off his team a little. There'll then be some specifics. Well, specifically, this is where we went wrong, but he'll never blame his players. There are other Premier League managers that do blame their players, Mourinho being one of them, but Klopp won't do that. And so I'm sure when they're in the dressing room, then he's probably put his finger on players more specifically, but certainly out in the public, he won't. And the other thing that Klopp is brilliant at, even when they lose, is finding things to be grateful for. Even though we didn't score, we created loads of chances, or the crowd were amazing. There'll always be something positive. And so for me, when you're trying to create this culture of reflection, some of it is about the language that we use, setting up a positive, reflective culture that steers clear of blame. And I do think, we can look at, it doesn't just need to be football. You can look at top leaders from other sports if you hate football, but be inspired by how some of these people talk. Look at how quality athletes talk after they've been defeated, and then use their language, steal their ideas, and bring it into your own leadership culture.
Excellent. Thank you, Andrew. And I suppose following on from that, you talked about it not being a blame game and the reflection and etc. But there could be a time where people are falling behind or have done a bad job. Are there any tips you could give with handling situations like that? That's a number of times that's been asked.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So, and listen, I get delegation wrong. I make mistakes sometimes. I'm human. I'm in a bad mood sometimes. And so let's use my teenage daughter. We get on pretty well, to be fair. But if I've delegated a job to her, maybe, it's a dishwasher. But she sometimes still gets things out of the dishwasher when they're still wet, and then puts them in the cupboard, and there'll be this pool of water. If that's annoying me, I'll feel cross at her. But actually, it's how can we do this job better? And actually, as the person that's delegated the task, I take some responsibility for how that task is delivered. So when I'm in a good frame of mind, I might be saying, listen, how can we do this better? If it stays wet, what's going to happen? And rather than saying you've done a bad job, again, it's asking questions that get the person to think about what they're doing, rather than you just telling them that it's wrong. I do think it helps in more complicated tasks at work is if someone's done something wrong, and I'm very careful to do this now, well, what can we do about this? How can I serve you better so that you are better equipped to do this job. And I'll always start from that point as a leader. And when I've gone into organizations where they have a very kind of old school annual professional review kind of a style, I always try and move them away to no, we need to start from how can we best serve our employees? That needs to be the starting point. Of course, there are standards that we expect. But again, when someone isn't meeting those standards, start thinking about the language that some of these sporting leaders use in order to get the best out of them, in order to take players that were okay and then they've raised their game. Some of that is down to this kind of culture of this positive culture. But if you noticed when I discussed Klopp, I said that he uses temporary language around the negativity. I said that he draws in externals to take the heat off his team, but then he focuses on specifics, real specifics. So the person doesn't get off the hook completely, and that's not obviously what we want, but where we're then drawing things to their attention, we need to be very specific that we are highlighting the actual thing rather than the person's inadequacies. That makes sense.
Yeah, perfect sense. Thank you, Andrew. Jan has asked a really good question. We potentially, some of the examples we've used is I'm working with my team and I'm delegating to a team member. But do you have any additional thoughts or advice for delegating upwards? So maybe I need to assign a task to someone more senior than myself.
I think the same still applies. The same still applies. But the boundaries is really important, because you need to know how far you will go in pushing your point. When you're going upwards, how far will you compromise? What are your castle walls? If you're compromising, if you're delegating upwards and you feel that it's not going well, what authority do you have to push that? And some of that will be down to the person above, their leadership style. Some of that will be down to your boundaries and how far you're prepared to push them. And you need to know your boundaries. That's why I think that the word boundaries is so important here with delegation. So I think the processes are similar. If you're in good respect and rapport with the person above you, if it's a two-way conversation, obviously if it's question-based, that still all applies. But I think the role of boundaries definitely becomes more important. You need to know when you're going to shut up if it's not going well, in a way that perhaps you wouldn't if you were delegating down the line. And that is down to your individual relationship and the boundaries, like I say, that you're going to put in place.
Yeah, so
there's no clear answer, I would say. I think it's a similar principle. The only thing I would say is knowing your own boundaries becomes so important if you're delegating upwards. That would be my gut feel for responding to that.
Excellent, thank you, Andrew. So it's your foundations, your people interaction, and again knowing your boundaries.
People will push you as far as they possibly can push you. We all do that as people. So you have to know how far you'll compromise and what you're prepared to accept. What you're prepared to accept from people beneath you and what you're prepared to accept from people above you. And I remember dealing with that. I was brought in once, and maybe I'm going slightly off on tangent, but I had to deal with this problem leader. And she was a woman in a firm of about 100. And she was dealing with some real macho-y buyers. And they were mostly men in the field that she was in. And their language with her was not appropriate. That they were not treating her as they should do, the buyers. And her employer did not want her to tackle that. She wanted to tackle it head on. They wanted her to put up with it. And when I did the work around the boundaries with her, she realized that actually she didn't want to be at that firm. She didn't want to have to put up with it. Her employer was quite clear. So it was her castle wall. It was breached, and she left the company. And so when you're delegating upwards, and you need to understand, well, if it's not going the way I want it, because I am dealing with more senior people, when do I shut up? When do I step back and say, okay, this hasn't worked? How far will I push this? Can I really stomach a war? Maybe you can. Maybe you should stomach a war. I've stomached wars where I've fought upwards before because to me it's really mattered. But there would be other situations where I'd say, well, I'll put a feeler out there, if I get knocked back, my head will go beneath the parapet again because I value my job. So it comes down to your boundaries, essentially.
Excellent. Thank you, Andrew. And apologies if there's some background noise. The bin men are just going past my house. But
Yes.
so we've spoke about individuals, and I think Kerrit makes a great question. In project meetings, there are often many actions for multiple team members in one session. How do you ensure effective delegation without holding a long and too detailed meeting?
I would want to meet with people individually, I think, and have those conversations individually rather than trying to create, like you say, a long, wearisome meeting. I think there's more value in short, sharp conversations individually, one-on-one, than all of you in a board meeting, unless, of course, everybody needs to hear everything. And so that's not clear. But if everybody in that room doesn't need to hear everything, I would be breaking it down into maybe having the conversation with one person or two, because although that might take up more time, I think that's preferable to having some wearisome, boring long meetings. And I've sat in board meetings before where it's hours and hours. It's just painful.
So, thank you, Andrew. And we've got a load of lovely questions coming through, but also a lot of lovely comments saying thank you again for taking the time to answer the questions. A lot of people have asked about the recording and your slides, and Andrew has kindly allowed us to record this, and we'll put it on APM YouTube. And as Andrew said, definitely reach out to him via social media, LinkedIn, and I'm sure Andrew will connect with you.
I think the other thing I might just add in as a little bugbear, and I know we were discussing this before I started presenting, if you want to delegate effectively online, because you're going to have to do that because Zoom is here to stay, and all the talk is around this hybrid of activity moving forward. Of course, we're going to get back to face-to-face stuff, but of course as well, you know, the online progress that we've made is here to stay, and beyond COVID, there's an environmental crisis and all that kind of stuff. And so one of my bugbears when I've been in board meetings online is often the person that might be delegating or the person that's leading, their internet's rubbish. So they're cutting in and they're cutting out, or the picture is grainy, or their background is just like this kind of, it's mess, or the opposite is just like a magnolia boring wall. And so I would say if you want to get better results from your communication with people online, definitely use an Ethernet cable to give you a more stable internet connection. I've actually got here, this is my 30-meter length of Ethernet cable, so I can cable up whichever room I'm in the house in. And whether I'm doing one-to-one coaching, whether I'm in board meetings, whatever I'm doing, I would never, ever do it without an Ethernet cable, because I respect the people on the call enough. Now, it might mean that my internet might go down on the road. That's beyond my control. But I've done all I can to ensure that people listening to me have a clear delivery. And so the other thing you could do, and I'm looking around because I don't know what I've actually done with it now. I've actually got, sitting on top of my laptop, you are currently looking at the webcam. It's an external webcam that sits on my laptop that's got built-in speakers. It's a Logitech. And this just gives you a slightly better visual, so that the picture's less grainy, better sound as well, so it's less tinny, and also the speakers on either side are quite good at getting rid of some of the sound outside this room that I don't want you to hear because I've got young children racing about. Do invest in something like that if you're doing a lot of online stuff. The external webcam is about 100 quid. It's not a massively expensive piece of kit. And even like with lighting, I've got, this is, I can't actually see myself, so I'm hoping, because this is like a ring light. It's 40 quid. It's very bright when you put it on. It adds, because in this front room at night, my lighting gets a bit dark. And so these are just little things that mean that as the viewer, you get a better experience when you're listening to me speak and whatever I'm saying. And so when you're doing your online stuff, do make some of these small adjustments. They won't cost a fortune, but you'll ensure that you are you're easier to listen to, which is of course half the battle. Even if you're asking questions about this task you're delegating out, the last thing you want is for you to be cutting out and freezing, and it's just annoying. And the other thing, the last thing to remember is I've been amazed, all the webinars I've done in the last year, I get so many comments about this yellow wall. It's just a yellow wall, but it's bright, it's light, it's just a little bit different. So maybe think about your background. Background slides can be a bit dodgy because as you move around, you'll fuzz in and you'll fuzz out of them, and that can be frustrating. But why not think about a bright, light background that is nice to look at? These are the small touches that all help people to engage with you, and it's particularly important online. So just thought I'd share that briefly.
That's perfect. Thank you, Andrew. I might have a chat to my wife and see if she wants a yellow wall.
Yeah.
I can already see that she'll delegate the job back to me to paint it. So maybe I'll keep that between us at the moment. Katie has asked a great question. Any tips for delegating to grumpy or difficult team members? Also, when you're delegating to those that may be older or more experienced in a certain area, and how to gain their respect in terms of getting them engaged?
I have, because although I work as a coach, I'm involved in organizations where I'm quite, I spend a lot of time in those organizations, so I know the teams really well. And there are grumpy people that I deal with, and I deal very directly with them. I wouldn't shy away from it. I think that's the first thing. I also really think with grumpy people, you never know when the right time is or when the wrong time is. And you can sometimes find yourself trying to pick the right moment. The right moment doesn't exist. So I very much go in there. I do find out how people are doing. Generally, if I'm going to delegate a task, it's conversation, like I say. Often I'll look, well, shall I make a cup of tea and sit down and make them a tea? Hey, I've got this task, need to do it. Can we chat about this for a while? I might be very, very, very polite with someone, but I will still be direct. And I think that's the thing. Don't shy away just because they're grumpy. But the same processes apply. You have those pillars in place. You build respect and rapport by trying to understand why someone's grumpy, I suppose. And the better you get to know them and that you share that you show that you do care about them, the better that is. And I remember I had to do some health and safety for a woodwork team. This was another charity that I supported, and they had a really bad relationship with management. And I came in and I'm sort of, I don't know anything about woodwork. I don't really, I know a bit about health and safety, but the health and safety in that woodwork team was terrible. I'm conscious of time, so I'll finish this quickly. And but my thing was, they're never going to do what I asked them to do. They're just not. So I'm going to live with the fact that the health and safety is terrible just for a few days. And I'm going to make them some cups of tea, just go and find out what they're working on, how they're doing, build some relationship, introduce myself, but I'm not going to start going on at them straight away. And so I got to know them a little bit. I complimented them on their work. Hey, that's amazing. Oh, I love what you've done on that. How did you do that? Asking those kind of questions. And then a few days later, I came in with, listen, a couple of things that worry me. I wonder if, I really care about you guys and I want this to work. And so they were a very grumpy team of woodwork carpenters who did not like management, and I was management. And yet I was able to get them to adhere to quite stringent health and safety measures that they weren't doing before, because I took the time to come in at their level, get to know them. Some of them had good reason to be grumpy about management, because the management before me was rubbish. So I think with grumpy people, the same things apply, but try and come in on their level and understand their journey first. And that may well help you to form a better dynamic with them, even though they will probably still be a bit grumpy from time to time.
Yeah, no, that's really good. Thank you. So, Andrew, you make a good point. We are coming close to the end. So I thoroughly encourage everyone to reach out to Andrew on social media. Andrew, I'll send the questions through to you that we've been unable to answer, to give you a heads up and to let you know what people are asking. But I personally would like to say thank you on behalf of the APM and everyone that's joined us today for your time, your knowledge, and also taking the time to answer people's questions.
No, thank you. It's been a pleasure, and I wish everybody a happy and productive Thursday and a great weekend. Not long now to the weekend.
Perfect. Thank you, Andrew. And everyone who's joined us today, thank you very much for getting involved and submitting the questions and for all the great comments you made about today's presentation. Keep an eye on the APM website. We've got lots of webinars coming up. So we hope you stay safe and we hope to see you soon. Bye for now.